A lot of things I could get into when it comes to coffee, but today we're going to keep it pretty simple and talk about how you can optimize the 3 basic steps of coffee making. So those 3 steps are selecting your beans, grinding the beans, and brewing the coffee. And we'll start with selecting the beans because those are obviously going to be the foundation of your coffee, and ultimately they'll have the biggest impact on how it actually tastes. And the beans are also the most misunderstood aspect of coffee in my opinion, because most people still just buy any old beans from the grocery store without really thinking about how recently they were roasted. You see, roasted coffee contains hundreds of aromatic compounds, and so the longer those beans sit, the more those flavorful compounds can escape. So for the best tasting, freshest coffee, you need to be using freshly roasted beans. And when I say freshly roasted, I mean roasted within at least the last 4 weeks, but within 2 to 3 weeks would be even better. Now for a lot of you should be able to find freshly roasted beans at your local grocery store, but there's also a good chance that you live near a local coffee roaster where you can pick up some great beans as well. Either way, you'll want to look out for beans that have the roasting date listed on the package, usually either on the bottom or the back of the bag. And if that date isn't listed, then those probably aren't beans that you want to be using. Personally, I actually use Trade Coffee, which is a subscription service where they send me freshly roasted beans from different roasters every few weeks. Now this video isn't sponsored or anything, and there's a lot of similar subscription services out there, but I have had a good experience with Trade Coffee so far, and it's super convenient to have those beans delivered straight to you on a regular basis, so whether you go with Trade or any other service, I definitely recommend it. Then once you start using freshly roasted beans, you can eventually branch out and experiment with beans grown in different regions of the world, roasted to different levels, and all of those types of things. But we're not going to talk about all of those nuances in this video because just using freshly roasted beans alone will get you most of the way to where you need to be. So now that we know which beans to use, let's talk about how to properly grind them. So yes, you should definitely be grinding your beans yourself if you can, because again, we want to preserve as much freshness in the beans as possible. And once they're ground, they start to lose their freshness much quicker than before because there's just so much surface area exposed to the atmosphere at that point. So the 2 factors that you really need to consider when grinding your coffee is number 1, to grind it fresh, ideally right before you brew the coffee, and number 2, to achieve a consistent grind size, meaning that all of your little bits of ground up coffee are approximately the same size. So grinding your beans fresh is something that everybody can do as long as you have a coffee grinder at home, but then how do we actually achieve a more consistent grind size? Well, it ultimately comes down to the type of grinder you use, and the type you should be using is called a burr grinder. This basically just means that the grinder contains a set of burrs that are evenly spaced apart in order to achieve the exact grind size that you're looking for. And the coffee just runs through those burrs one single time, which results in a very consistent grind. Whereas if you look at the blade grinders that a lot of people use, the beans just sort of twirl around in there, and some pieces might get pushed to the outside and not get ground much at all, while other pieces will get overground, and that leads to an uneven extraction of flavor when you actually brew the coffee. So for that reason, it's very important to achieve as uniform a grind as possible. So you can get either an electric or a handheld burr grinder, and which one you get really just depends on your budget and your preferences. Unfortunately, great burr grinders can get pretty expensive, especially the electric ones, so if you're on a budget, you'll definitely want to go handheld. And that's actually what I use personally, so while this one still wasn't cheap per se at around $180, the grind quality is just as good as electric grinders that are double or almost triple the price, and I actually prefer the hand grinder anyways because it's quieter and it takes up much less space in my kitchen. And it only takes about 30 seconds to grind my typical serving of coffee beans, so it's really not too bad. But before I got this one, I started with a cheaper handheld grinder that I got for around $40, and it still gave me much better results than any non-burr grinder. So I'll link both of those below, and I'll also link some of the most recommended electric burr grinders for those of you that prefer the ease and convenience of those. The good news is that your grinder is really the only significant investment you need to make into your coffee setup, assuming you're not planning to get into espresso, and a good quality grinder should last pretty much indefinitely. So with all of that said, it's finally time to talk brewing. And for this video, we're going to discuss 3 different brewing methods, all of which achieve slightly different results. So I'll start with my personal favorite method, which is the pour over. And this is also the one that'll achieve the most traditional tasting cup if you're used to brewing with an automatic coffee machine, because we're brewing through a paper filter here just as a machine does. Now depending on which method you use, you'll need to vary your grind size. So for a pour over, we're going to use a medium fine grind, which I would say is just a bit finer than sand. And here you can see it alongside a dime for scale. Now there are a lot of pour over brewers to choose from, but personally I'd recommend the Kalita Wave for most people, which is what I'm using here because it's very forgiving and actually quite inexpensive as well. Now from there, the brewing process itself is pretty simple. So you'll just start by bringing a pot of water up to a boil, then rinsing your filter paper with that boiling water to get rid of any paper taste. And this also serves the purpose of warming up your brewer and your mug as well. Of course, make sure to use good tasting water for your coffee, so I typically just use filtered tap water. Then after discarding your rinse water, go ahead and toss your ground coffee into the brewer. And you can really use any amount of ground coffee here as long as you keep the ratio of grounds to water consistent. I'd recommend using a ratio of 16:1 water to coffee, so I'm using 20 grams of coffee beans here to 320 grams of water. Then from there you can adjust the ratio to suit your preferences, so if you like your coffee a bit stronger, you could try a ratio of 14:1 for example. So you can see it's pretty much essential to have a digital scale in order to really dial in your coffee and make it consistently delicious. So once your grounds are in the brewer, just start by pouring in about 1/8 of your total water. So in my case here, that's 40 grams. Try to cover all of the grounds, and I also like to give them a quick stir to make sure that everything's saturated. Then wait about 30 seconds. This is known as the bloom phase, and it basically just allows the carbon dioxide from the beans to escape, which allows the water to flow through the beans more evenly, and it'll prevent too much sourness from infusing into the coffee. So after that 30 seconds, just slowly add the rest of your water, pouring in circles like so to ensure an even extraction. If your water reaches the top of your cone, just wait about 10 to 15 seconds for the water to draw down a bit, then continue pouring. And after all of your water is added, that's essentially it. So now you just have to wait for the water to finish running through the grounds. This should take about 1.5 to 2.5 minutes, so if it goes significantly faster than that, you may need to grind finer, and if it goes significantly slower, you may need to grind coarser. Toward the end of the brewing, I also like to give the brewer a little shake just to make sure that everything gets drawn through. But once it stops dripping, then the coffee is done. And from there, the cleanup is super easy, so you can just dump out the filter into the trash or a compost bin if you have one, then rinse your brewer, and that's it. Now next we're going to cover the French press method, which will yield a much fuller bodied coffee because there's no filter paper here to absorb the coffee's oils as they're extracted from the beans. So for this, I like to use James Hoffmann's French press method, which is designed to reduce the amount of sediment in the coffee, resulting in a much cleaner cup. So I'll link his full video tutorial in the description below, but for this method, again, you'll start by grinding your coffee, this time to a medium coarse grind, or about the size of a relatively coarse sand. Then bring your water up to a boil and use a bit of it to preheat your French press along with your mug. Now add your ground coffee to the French press, and again we'll be using a 16:1 ratio of water to coffee here. So add your water all at once, there's no need for a blooming phase here, and just make sure to saturate all of the grounds. Then place your lid back on the French press to trap in the heat, and set a timer for 4 minutes. After that 4 minutes, stir the surface of the coffee, which will free up the grounds that are sitting at the top. Then skim off the foam from the surface because that foam is pretty bitter, so you don't want it in your final product. Now you're actually going to place the lid back on and wait at least another 5 minutes for all of the grounds to settle back to the bottom. And don't press down with the plunger because the whole idea here is to be as gentle as possible with the coffee so that those grounds don't make their way back into the solution. Then after the 5 minutes is up, just gently pour the coffee into your mug, again without pressing the plunger down, but instead just using it as a filter for the coffee to pour through. And there's your cup of French press coffee. Now last but not least, we're going to quickly discuss the cold brew method, which is great for those of you who like a smooth, slightly less bitter cup of iced coffee. And this one is very similar to the French press method, but instead of pouring hot water onto the grounds, we're going to use cold water and then just let the coffee steep for much longer. So we're brewing with cold water, hence the name cold brew. So again, place your coffee grounds into the French press, this time without preheating it, and I like to make my cold brew in larger batches, so I'm using 40 grams of ground coffee here. And you don't need to use a French press for this, so you could actually do this in any jar or bowl with a lid. And for cold brew, I like to use a 12:1 ratio of water to coffee so that it ends up a bit stronger and doesn't become too diluted when you add ice to it. So I'm adding 480 grams of water here all at once, making sure the grounds are fully submerged. The water can be either cold or at room temperature, it doesn't really matter, and you want to stir it a bit if necessary to make sure all of the grounds are saturated. Then just place your lid on and let the coffee steep for 12 to 16 hours at room temperature. Once it's done, just strain it out either through a paper coffee filter or a cheesecloth as I'm doing here. Then enjoy right away with ice or store in your fridge for up to about a week for the freshest tasting coffee. So now that you know how to make even better coffee, if you missed the first few episodes of this Cooking Made Easy series, where I break down the basic principles of cooking, be sure to click the playlist in the bottom right corner of the screen. So there you go. I'll see you all in the next one.